Today I would like to draw your attention to Matthew Gospel chapter 5 verses 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meekness is an opposite of being out of control. Meekness is not the weakness. Meekness is one of the fruit of the Spirit according to Galatians chapter 5 verses 23. Jesus said, Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. There is a little difference between being poor in spirit and being meek. A man who is poor in spirit speaks of what he is in himself. But a man who is meek in spirit shows his character and his relationship to God and to his fellow man. And this quotation was taken from Psalm 37:11. In this verse it speaks of a person who is not resentful, a person who really bears no grudge. Far from mulling over the injuries received, he finds refuge in the Lord and commits his ways entirely to Him. The meek person is the one who bears no grudge. A man is not being moved or affected by the appreciation and the depreciation of men. He is a man who really died to self-righteousness. A man who really analyzes himself and he knows that he cannot claim any merit before God. And he has nothing good in himself where he can boast before God. But meekness is not the weakness. A meek person will not bow to every beast. He will not bow down and he will not oblige to every Tom, Dick and Harry. A meek person really shows his strength in the midst of opposition, in the midst of unfavorable circumstances, in the midst of every challenges. A meek person completely rests in the mighty hands of God. A beautiful example that we find in the life of Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 4. Let me read verses 3. We give no offense in anything that our ministry may not be blamed, but in all things we commend ourselves as the ministers of God in much patience, in tribulation, in needs, in distress, in stripes, in imprisonment, etc. In this passage we see Paul's catalogs some of the characteristics of his ministry. The first thing was patient. He says in much patience. In 6:4, in much patience. Paul was writing this letter to the Corinthians from being in Rome. And then he said, we endured all these things, the trials, we endured every persecution, every wrong report against us. And he was able to endure all these things because he had a tremendous power of being patient. And that's one of the character of the meekness. That's the true character of a meek person. Paul says, we were not moved by the persecution. We were not moved by when people spoke evil of us, when people put us down. We were able to endure all these things. Actually, Paul was not a man of patience. By nature, Paul was not patient. In his unconverted days, he had been intolerant of opposition. And when there was a persecution broke out in the days of an apostle, when Christianity was spreading rapidly in Jerusalem, this issue of Christianity was brought before the Sanhedrin. And there was a Bible school in Jerusalem, and Gamaliel was the chief professor of that school. So when this issue was brought before the Sanhedrin, especially before Gamaliel, what comment he made? It says in Acts of the Apostle chapter 5 verses 34 to 39, we find that Gamaliel said, wait and see what would develop in the Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem and not be hasty in its action. This was a prediction by a chief professor, Gamaliel. In fact, Paul himself studied under the feet of Gamaliel. But Paul, knowing Gamaliel's advice, he deliberately refuted it because he was intolerant to the spread of Christianity. He was intolerant of the opposition in his unconverted days. When people were spreading their Christianity, he considered that was an attack to the Jewish religion. Therefore, Paul could not tolerate. So he came against the Christians without waiting patiently in spite of Gamaliel's advice, whom he has to respect and honor because he was his professor. He was his master. But we see Paul had no patience of waiting. But then when he got converted, when he became a true servant of God, there were much persecution and there were people speaking evil of him. His ministry was threatened by the false prophets and false teachers. In the midst of all these things, Paul did not respond to all their oppositions. He waited quietly in the presence of the Lord. He ended all these things. That is the wonderful example of being meek. Meek in the sense, you withstand every criticism, you withstand every opposition that is against you, and you don't jump in order to fight for your rights, and you don't even try to prove that you are right. Sometimes it's not needed. Sometimes it's needed to explain when there's a confusion, that you need to place it very clear for people to understand so that they can also be free from misunderstanding you. But meekness is something that you are strong on yourself in the power of God. Meekness was a part of Lord's own character according to Matthew 11:29. It was the characteristic that he recommended to his own as a source of happiness and as an essential in those who wish to inherit the earth. A characteristic of Nebuchadnezzar that, he was a world conqueror, and this conqueror, this mighty Nebuchadnezzar, learned meekness when he was put in the forest for 7 years. He humbled himself, and there he learned the true meekness according to Daniel chapter 2 verses 38 and again chapter 4 verses 34 to 37. It is one of the fruit of the Spirit according to Galatians 5:23, and a rare one at that. People really don't seek for meekness. Today people pray for power, people want the gifts of healing, people want the gift of prophecy, people want several other gifts. That is well and good. But are you really interested in the inner character of being meek? Do you really seek God and cry out to God? Because that you are not patient in many situations. Jesus is an example to us. In the midst of a terrible persecution, in the midst of a trial, when the whole entire nation and the entire people of the Sanhedrin was placing a complaint against Jesus, when they are blaspheming Jesus, he was silent. He didn't answer even a word. That tells us how powerful Jesus Christ was. Then Pilate, then Herod, then all the Sanhedrins, and then all the Roman soldiers were questioning him and were trying to get an answer from Jesus. We find that Jesus did not answer a word. He ended all these things because of the wonderful character of meekness. He is a wonderful example to us. The blessedness of those who are meek consists in this, that they shall inherit the earth. In a sense, they inherit it even now. And this is for several reasons. By not paying undue attention to enriching themselves, but rather by doing their duty before God and fulfilling their task on earth. In other words, by first and the most of all seeking God's kingdom and His righteousness on all these things, that is the food, clothing, and all other needs are graciously bestowed upon them as an extra gift according to Matthew 6:33. The law of indirection is by no means a dead letter. Our very meekness makes a blessing to the fellow men, some of whom will bless them in return. 2:44. They may possess only a small portion of this earth or of earthly goods, but a small portion with God's blessing resting upon it is more than the greatest riches without God's blessing. Few formal and legal sense does a man soul is ranked by a fear of coming judgment really possesses earthly goods. Does he possess them in the sense of enjoying them? Or of course not. It is who has them. They have a comparison of the. So let's plead and come to the Lord and crawl for this fruit of the Spirit of meekness. When you have this meekness, you will inherit the earth. May God bless.